Hey all, welcome back to the channel. So in this video, we'll be talking about how you can implement rule-based authentication in Grafana. So to give you a high-level overview of what we are doing, so we have a Node-RED, and we'll be using this authentication using Node-RED. Now, let's say a user logs into Grafana, he passes user credentials, his username and password. Now in Grafana, instead of hooking the panels directly to a data source, we'll use HTTP APIs as a data source. In this case, we'll use Infinity plugin that lets us call HTTP APIs in Grafana. And using this, we'll pass the user credentials with those HTTP APIs, and in Node-RED, we'll authenticate the user essentially. So this authentication, you can use a database to authenticate the user, or you can use a third-party system that you have to authenticate a user. But in this scenario, I just have a simple if and else statement to authenticate a user. So this is essentially how the flow looks, or how this system works. Now, this is not the most secure way of doing this, but hopefully it'll give you some idea of how you can implement like role-based or rules-based authentication in Grafana. All right, now coming back to Grafana and Node-RED. Now, first Grafana, I have a simple authorized panel here. It's a stat panel, and I'm hitting an API called panel that essentially calls this API that's in my Node-RED server. And both of these things right now are running on my local host. So before looking at the panel API, I have another API here called user API, which essentially fetches the token from the user based on the logged in user, and then passes it to Grafana. So to do that, we'll use Grafana variables. So I have a variable defined here called user token, and this again calls an HTTP API, and the API is user, and here I'm passing the user's email, the logged in user's email. And this essentially goes to our user API, and here we are just checking if the user is admin, then return this token. If user is Ashish, then return this token. Otherwise, it won't return anything. And this is where you can essentially integrate a third-party application or do something more complicated than what I have here, or integrate a database. But this is essentially becomes your role-based access system. So based on a certain role, you can have a payload with a role, with a token, based on the permission level set for that particular user. All right. So once this is done, we actually receive the token as a variable in Grafana. Now this variable is currently hidden from the dashboard, so you don't actually see anything on the dashboard, but there's a token that has been assigned to this user token variable. And our token is called, this is a token which has been defined right here. All right, now coming to the panel itself. Now here we're calling a panel API. Again, this goes to our Node-RED HTTP API called panel. And this is where we essentially validate the token. So in our parameters, we are passing the user token, which we got in a variable in the previous step. And we are also passing to and from if you ever need to pass the selected date range from an API. This is how you do it. But essentially, this is what we are looking at today. So we're passing the user token from the variable. So once this user tokens come to an API, we essentially validate this user token. So if the user token is, this is a token, which is a valid user token for that user, we return authorize is true. Otherwise, authorize is false. And this is essentially what we get in our payload, authorize is true or false. So you can add more to it. Basically, if the user is authorized, then pass this much data. or if the user has this much access, then remove these values or do something else. But just to keep it simple, this is essentially what are we plotting in our Grafana panel. So that's that. So that's why we see true here, because the user is authorized. Now, if I log out from Grafana and log in as a different user, you'll see authorized is false because I'm not essentially authorized to view this page. And that check is essentially happening here because we don't have that user in our system yet. So the user doesn't have a token. So I don't have a permission to view this panel or essentially view the data in this panel. So I hope that kind of gives you some idea of how you can implement a role-based access control or a rule-based access system in Grafana, essentially using HTTP APIs. You can also make it much more complex than what I have here, but hopefully this was a good starting point. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Cheers.